The first time they got it wrong, I noticed immediately. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't ambiguous. They said something about me that wasn't true. Not cruel, not harmful, just incorrect. I remember the exact moment it happened because my body reacted before my thoughts did. A small tightening in my chest, a pause where I should have spoken. I opened my mouth slightly, and then I didn't say anything. At the time, it felt insignificant. Correcting them would have taken effort. Explaining would have slowed things down. Letting it pass felt easier. So I let it pass. I didn't know then that silence has momentum, that once you let a version of you exist out loud, it doesn't stay small. That first moment didn't change anything immediately. That's why it mattered.
I've never been comfortable interrupting people, especially when they aren't being unkind. Correcting someone feels confrontational, even when it's calm. It introduces friction where none existed before, and I had become very good at avoiding friction. So when they misunderstood me, I told myself it wasn't worth fixing. It doesn't really matter. They'll figure it out eventually. It's close enough. Those thoughts came quickly, stacked together like a justification. I remember nodding along as they continued talking. The conversation moved on, and with it, the wrong version of me stayed in the room. At first, that version didn't feel dangerous. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't contradict how I saw myself. It was just slightly off. But being slightly off is how bigger misunderstandings begin, because people build on what they think they know, and I let them build. I told myself that staying quiet was polite, that it kept things smooth, that correcting them would have felt unnecessary. What I didn't consider was that smoothness has a cost. Every time I chose not to speak, the gap widened. Not dramatically, quietly. And I didn't notice how quickly it was becoming normal.
The next time it came up, I wasn't surprised. I noticed it because it sounded more confident. The way they said it felt practiced, like something they had already repeated to someone else. That was the moment I understood something important. The first time, it had been a mistake. This time, it was a belief. They weren't checking with me. They weren't asking for confirmation. They were explaining me to someone else. I stood there, listening as my name was used to support a story I hadn't told. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't dramatic. That made it harder to interrupt. Correcting something mild feels more awkward than correcting something extreme. If it had been obviously wrong, I would have stepped in. But this version was close enough to feel familiar. I told myself it wasn't worth the pause it would create, so I let it continue. And by doing that, I gave it permission to travel. I began noticing small changes in how people approached me. Questions were framed differently. Assumptions were made quietly. They responded to me as if they already knew certain things I hadn't shared, things I hadn't chosen. I remember thinking that this was temporary, that misunderstandings naturally correct themselves. But misunderstandings don't correct themselves when they're being reinforced. They settle. They become the foundation for future conversations. And suddenly, I was being met as someone I hadn't agreed to be. At some point, I noticed something that unsettled me more than the misunderstanding itself. I was adapting to it. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in small ways that added up. I answered questions that assumed the wrong thing. I avoided details that would have complicated the story. I chose words carefully so I wouldn't contradict what people already believed. That was when I realized I wasn't just staying quiet. I was participating. Every time I adjusted myself to fit the misunderstanding, I reinforced it. It became easier to do that than to stop and reset everything. Resetting would have required explanation. Explanation would have required admitting that I had let this go on, and that felt uncomfortable. So I continued. I told myself I was keeping things simple, that I was avoiding unnecessary tension. But simplicity came at the cost of honesty. Not because I was lying, but because I wasn't correcting. There's a difference, and that difference matters. I remember a moment where someone referenced something about me that simply wasn't true. Not harmful, just inaccurate. I nodded. That nod felt heavier than it should have, because it confirmed something that wasn't mine to confirm. After that, the line became harder to see. Where did the misunderstanding end, and where did my consent begin? I didn't know anymore, and that uncertainty stayed with me longer than I expected. The first time it felt like it was defining me, I noticed it immediately. Someone reacted to something I said in a way that didn't match what I meant. They responded to the version of me they believed in, not the one I was actually presenting. That moment landed quietly. I remember pausing, just long enough to realize that correcting them would have required more than a sentence. It would have required undoing assumptions. And assumptions are heavier than statements. They don't disappear just because you explain yourself once. They resist. I could feel that resistance already forming. The wrong version of me wasn't just circulating anymore. It was being referenced, relied on, used to make sense of things. And I hadn't stopped it when I still could have. There came a point where correcting the misunderstanding felt risky. Not dangerous, just disruptive. It would have required me to interrupt a narrative that had already settled. People don't like revisiting things they believe they already understand. Correcting them would have raised questions. Not accusatory ones, curious ones. And curiosity can feel invasive when you're not prepared for it. I imagined the conversations that would follow. Why didn't you say something earlier? When did this change? What's actually true then? None of those questions were unreasonable, but answering them would have meant admitting that I had allowed the misunderstanding to exist, that I had benefited from the ease it created, that I had chosen comfort over accuracy. That admission felt heavier than staying quiet, so I stayed quiet. I told myself that correcting things later would be easier, that timing mattered. But timing has a way of slipping past you when you're waiting for the perfect moment. The longer it went on, the more the wrong version felt official. Not because anyone declared it so, but because no one questioned it, including me. I noticed how I started preparing myself before social situations, not to be myself, but to be consistent. Consistency became the goal, and consistency required me to keep playing the role I hadn't chosen. That realization arrived slowly, and when it didn't come with urgency. It came with a quiet sense of loss. Loss of spontaneity, loss of ease, loss of the version of myself that didn't need monitoring. By the time I admitted that to myself, the misunderstanding had already done its work. It wasn't just something people believed anymore. It was something I was maintaining. The cost didn't show up as a single consequence. There was no moment where everything went wrong. It showed up as effort, the effort of remembering what version of myself people expected, the effort of staying consistent with a story I hadn't chosen, the effort of filtering my reactions before they reached my face. That effort became constant. I didn't notice it right away because it blended into my days. It felt like maturity, like being thoughtful, like social awareness. But over time, it started to feel heavier. I realized I was rarely fully present in conversations anymore. Part of my attention was always elsewhere, monitoring, adjusting, editing. I wasn't lying, but I wasn't relaxed either. I missed the ease of speaking without checking myself first. I missed not having to remember what I had let people believe. That was the real cost. Not reputation, not conflict, but the quiet distance it created between who I was and who I was allowed to be. I noticed how tired I felt after interactions that should have been simple. Not emotionally drained, just worn down, like something had been held in place for too long. And I understood then that being understood wrong doesn't just affect how others see you, it affects how you see yourself, slowly. Eventually, the situation changed. Not because I corrected anyone, not because I confronted the misunderstanding. Time shifted things. People moved on. Contexts changed. The version of me they believed in faded quietly. That ending didn't feel satisfying. There was no moment of relief, just a soft awareness of what I had learned. I learned that silence isn't neutral. It's a choice that keeps choosing itself if you don't interrupt it. I learned how quickly convenience can replace truth, how easily politeness can become self-erasure. I don't regret staying quiet at first. That matters. I understand why I did, but I do regret how long I let it go on. Not because it caused damage, but because it taught me how easily I could disappear from my own story. Now when someone gets it wrong, I pause differently. Not urgently, not defensively, just long enough to decide whether silence is actually protecting peace or just postponing clarity. Because clarity doesn't have to be loud to be real. And sometimes the most important corrections are the quiet ones we make for ourselves after everyone sleeps.